In the year 218 BCE, the Iberian Peninsula, a land of jagged mountains, fertile plains, and fiercely independent tribes, became the unlikely stage for one of the greatest confrontations of the ancient world. The Second Punic War had erupted between Rome and Carthage, two of the Mediterranean's preeminent powers. Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general whose name would become synonymous with military genius, had already made his legendary march across the Alps into Italy, threatening the very heart of Rome. But Rome knew that to contain Hannibal and secure its future, it had to strike at Carthage's holdings in Iberia. It was here, in this rugged, fragmented peninsula, that the story of Roman Hispania, the earliest continuous chapter of Spanish recorded history, would begin. The Iberian Peninsula in the 3rd century BCE was a mosaic of tribal societies, each with its own culture, language, and political structures. The Celtiberians in the Central Plateau were warlike and fiercely independent, renowned for their ironworking skills and heavily armed infantry. To the west, the Lusitanians roamed the rivers and hills of modern Portugal, practicing guerrilla warfare that would frustrate Roman generals for decades. Along the southern and eastern coasts, cities founded by the Phoenicians and Greeks, like Gator, modern Cadiz, and Emporion, modern Emperies, were thriving centers of trade, connecting Iberia to the wider Mediterranean. These cities introduced early urbanization, literacy, and commerce, leaving a cultural imprint that Rome would later integrate into its empire. In 218 BCE, Rome dispatched a military expedition led by the proconsul Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Calvus, while his brother Publius Cornelius Scipio, later Scipio Africanus, advanced into southern Iberia. Their objectives were clear: seize control of Carthaginian territories, secure local alliances, and prevent Hannibal from drawing further reinforcements from Iberia. The Romans quickly discovered that conquering the peninsula would be no simple task. Tribal confederations and fortified hilltop settlements resisted with tenacity, exploiting their knowledge of the rugged terrain. The famous siege of Saguntum in 219 BCE, although initiated by Carthage, had set a precedent. These communities would fight to the last man to defend their autonomy. Roman strategy in Hispania was methodical. The military employed legions supported by auxiliaries, establishing fortified camps along strategic routes and near river crossings, creating a network of control that slowly extended Roman influence. Cities such as Tarraco, modern Tarragona, and Emerita Augusta, modern Merida, founded later during Augustus's reign, would become enduring centers of administration, culture, and commerce, standing as testaments to Rome's transformative influence. The Romans also introduced roads, aqueducts, and urban planning, linking disparate communities and facilitating the movement of troops and goods. The famous Via Augusta, stretching along the eastern coast, connected Hispania to the broader Roman world, enabling trade and military logistics that would underpin the peninsula's integration into the empire. The conquest, however, was not a straightforward series of victories. Indigenous resistance was persistent. Leaders like Viriathus, a Lusitanian chieftain, orchestrated guerrilla campaigns that inflicted repeated defeats on Roman forces during the 2nd century BCE. Viriathus became a symbol of local resistance, employing ambushes, scorched earth tactics, and intimate knowledge of the landscape to outmaneuver larger, better-equipped Roman legions. His assassination in 139 BCE, reportedly orchestrated through bribery by Rome, marked the end of organized Lusitanian resistance, but left a legacy of defiance that resonated throughout the peninsula. Despite these challenges, Romanization progressed. By the 1st century BCE, under leaders such as Pompey and Julius Caesar, the Romans had subdued major tribal confederations, reorganized the territories into provinces, and imposed their legal and administrative frameworks. Hispania was divided into Hispania Superior and Hispania Ulterior, later refined into Tarraconensis, Baetica, and Lusitania under Augustus. Roman law, taxation systems, and civic institutions were introduced, and local elites were co-opted into the imperial system. Cities adopted Roman architecture, including forums, theaters, baths, and temples, symbolizing not only Roman power, but also the gradual transformation of Iberian identity. Latin became the lingua franca, replacing local dialects in administration and commerce, laying the foundation for the future Romance languages of the region. Economically, Hispania became a crucial contributor to Rome's wealth. Rich deposits of silver, gold, and copper were mined in regions like Rio Tinto and Sierra Morena, fueling the empire's coffers. Olive oil, wine, and cereals were exported to Italy and across the Mediterranean, while Hispania's horses and livestock supplied Roman armies. The integration of Iberian trade networks into the Mediterranean economy catalyzed urban growth and increased cultural exchanges, with Greek, Phoenician, and native Iberian traditions merging into a Romanized Hispania. Culturally, Hispania produced individuals of immense influence within the broader Roman Empire. Notably, several Roman emperors hailed from the peninsula, including Trajan, r. 98 to 117 CE, and Hadrian, r. 117 to 138 CE. Their reigns underscored the depth of Hispania's integration into the empire, highlighting the transformation of a once remote frontier into a crucible for imperial leadership. Roman Hispania also saw the spread of religion, including early Roman pagan cults, and the gradual introduction of Christianity in the 1st and 2nd century CE, particularly in urban centers like Tarraco and Emerita Augusta. Yet, as with all empires, the Roman grip on Hispania was not permanent. By the 3rd century CE, internal strife, economic strain, and the broader crisis of the 3rd century weakened imperial authority. Rebellions, piracy, and incursions by external groups increasingly challenged Roman control. Hispania, once a bastion of Roman order, became a theater of instability. The legions remained, but their loyalty was tested, and local administrations struggled to maintain tax collection and security. By the early 5th century CE, the weakening of Rome opened the door to Germanic migrations. Vandals, Suebi, and Alans entered Hispania, initially as federati settlers enlisted to protect Roman interests, but soon as conquerors. The collapse of centralized Roman authority was gradual, yet inexorable. Cities that had once symbolized Roman order, Tarraco, Emerita Augusta, and Italic, witnessed declining populations, economic contraction, and the fracturing of civic institutions. Local communities adapted, blending Roman, Iberian, and emerging Germanic traditions. Hispania was no longer merely a Roman province. It was becoming a patchwork of post-Roman polities, setting the stage for the next great chapter of the peninsula's history, the rise of the Visigothic Kingdom. Through nearly 7 centuries, Roman Hispania had transformed a wild and fragmented peninsula into a region interconnected by roads, law, language, and culture. The Iberian tribes that once resisted the might of Rome were assimilated, repurposed, and reshaped, leaving a legacy that would influence governance, law, language, architecture, and identity for centuries to come. Yet, the story of Hispania was far from over. The legacies of Rome would endure, but the collapse of imperial authority invited new powers, new conflicts, and new opportunities, beginning a dynamic historical cycle that would characterize the Iberian Peninsula for the next millennium. As the Western Roman Empire faltered in the early 5th century CE, the Iberian Peninsula, once tightly woven into Rome's administrative and cultural fabric, entered a new era of transformation and uncertainty. The legions that had marched from Rome, roads still crisscrossing the land, and the grand architecture of Roman Hispania, all that remained of Roman order, were increasingly overshadowed by migratory peoples seeking footholds in a weakening empire. Among these groups were the Visigoths, a Germanic people whose trajectory from the forests of Central Europe would intertwine indelibly with the fate of Hispania. The Visigoths' arrival was initially as foederati, allies and mercenaries enlisted by Rome to defend the empire's frontiers against other migratory tribes. In 409 CE, in the wake of the Vandals, Suebi, and Alans crossing the Pyrenees and entering the peninsula, the Visigoths, under King William, were granted lands in southwestern Hispania as part of a formal agreement with the Roman authorities. This arrangement was mutually. Religion was a central axis of both governance and identity. Initially, the Visigoths practiced Arian Christianity, a branch of Christianity considered heretical by the Catholic Church for its denial of the full divinity of Christ. This religious divergence created tension between the Visigothic rulers and the largely Catholic Hispano-Roman population. It was under King Richard I, r. 586 to 601, that the kingdom underwent a dramatic transformation. Richard converted to Catholicism, publicly renouncing Arianism at the Third Council of Toledo in 589. This conversion was not only a spiritual decision, but also a shrewd political strategy. By aligning with the religious beliefs of the majority, Richard strengthened royal legitimacy, reduced internal religious tension, and integrated the Hispano-Roman elite more fully into the Visigothic administration. Legal codification was another hallmark of the Visigothic era. The Liber Judiciarum, also known as the Visigothic Code, promulgated in 654 under King Chindisuith, was a monumental legal achievement. This code unified laws for both Visigoths and Hispano-Romans, transcending tribal distinctions and establishing a single framework for civil, criminal, and property law. It represented a profound continuation of Roman legal tradition, adapted to the realities of a post-Roman kingdom. The code addressed marriage, inheritance, contracts, and crime, ensuring stability and predictability within a kingdom that was otherwise defined by volatile succession politics and regionalism. Despite these efforts at centralization, the Visigothic kingdom faced recurring challenges. Succession crises were common, as the monarchy was elective among the noble class, leading to power struggles that often resulted in violence or assassination. Regionalism persisted as former Roman cities retained local privileges, and various noble factions, some Visigothic, some Hispano-Roman, vied for influence over the throne. These internal fractures would ultimately weaken the kingdom at a critical moment, leaving it vulnerable to external invasion. The Visigoths also engaged with their neighbors diplomatically and militarily. To the north, the Franks represented both threat and opportunity. Alliances and conflicts oscillated over decades, with marriages and treaties shaping political strategy. To the south, the Mediterranean remained a conduit for trade, culture, and occasionally military expeditions, particularly in the Balearic Islands. The kingdom maintained a delicate balance, strong enough to dominate the peninsula, but not impermeable to the forces of history pressing upon it. Culturally, the Visigothic kingdom was a fusion of Roman heritage and Germanic tradition. Latin remained the language of administration and law, while Gothic culture shaped martial ethos and elite identity. Art and architecture blended Roman motifs with Germanic symbolism, as seen in church construction and decorative arts. Christianity, now largely Catholic, became a tool for consolidating authority, but it also facilitated intellectual life. Scriptoria in Toledo produced manuscripts that preserved both classical texts and emerging theological writings, ensuring the continuity of learning in a time often described as dark or transitional. Economically, Hispania under the Visigoths was predominantly agrarian. Land ownership was concentrated among the nobility, while peasants and freedmen worked estates that produced cereals, olives, grapes, and livestock. Urban centers, though smaller than their Roman predecessors, remained hubs of trade and craft. Roads and aqueducts built by Rome continued to function, underscoring the persistence of Roman infrastructure in shaping daily life. Hispania was, in many respects, a land of continuity amid transformation. Roman legacies persisted even as new power structures and cultural norms took root. The kingdom also faced the challenge of maintaining security across a large, diverse territory. Fortifications were reinforced in key cities, and garrisons were maintained to repel raiders from the north or Mediterranean pirates. Military organizations relied on a combination of professional warriors and levied forces from local communities. Despite these precautions, by the early 8th century, Visigothic control had weakened in the southern regions, particularly along the Guadalquivir Valley, creating openings for external forces that would soon arrive from North Africa. This vulnerability culminated in 711 CE, when an army led by Tariq ibn Ziyad, a Berber commander under the Umayyad Caliphate, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar. At the Battle of Guadalete, the Visigothic king Roderick faced a formidable Muslim force. Though the exact details remain debated, contemporary sources suggest that internal dissent among the Visigothic nobility, coupled with the kingdom's fragmented military response, contributed to Roderick's defeat and death. This battle marked not only the collapse of Visigothic hegemony in southern Iberia, but also the end of an era. Within a few years, most of the peninsula would fall under Muslim control, ushering in the next dramatic chapter of Spanish history, the establishment of Al-Andalus. The Visigothic kingdom, despite its ultimate fall, left an enduring legacy. It bridged the gap between Roman Hispania and medieval Spain, preserving Roman law, administrative structures, and urban life, while introducing new governance, military organization, and cultural synthesis. Its leaders, laws, and religious policies shaped the Iberian identity, influencing both Christian and Muslim rulers in the centuries to follow. The kingdom's story exemplifies the interplay of continuity and change, demonstrating how a former Roman province could evolve into a Germanic kingdom that would, for a brief yet impactful period, define the Iberian Peninsula. By the end of the 7th century, Hispania had transformed from a Roman province into a Visigothic kingdom characterized by centralized monarchy, codified law, and a Catholic religious framework. Yet, as history would show repeatedly, the survival of states depends not only on internal consolidation, but also on the ability to repel external pressures. The Visigoths, for all their achievements in unifying and governing the peninsula, faced a moment in 711 when internal divisions and external forces intersected with catastrophic consequences. Their kingdom's fall would set the stage for centuries of Muslim rule and Christian reconquest, an era that would define the medieval history of Spain. In the summer of 711 CE, the Iberian Peninsula, once dominated by the Visigothic kingdom, faced a seismic upheaval that would redefine its history for centuries. The Visigothic monarchy, weakened by internal factionalism, succession disputes, and regional rebellions, could no longer present a unified front against external threats. At this critical juncture, Tariq ibn Ziyad, a Berber commander under the Umayyad Caliphate, landed on the rocky promontory of Gibraltar with a small but disciplined force. The crossing of the Strait of Gibraltar marked the beginning of the Muslim conquest of Hispania, an event that historians would remember as one of the most rapid and consequential transformations in European history. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Guadalete, where King Roderick of the Visigoths faced Tariq's forces. Contemporary accounts suggest that Roderick commanded an army of approximately 25,000, while Tariq's force was smaller, composed mainly of Berber troops and a contingent of Arab warriors. Yet numbers alone did not determine the outcome. Roderick's army was fractured by internal dissent. Noble factions within the Visigothic ranks reportedly withheld support or defected, undermining the cohesion necessary for victory. Within days, the Visigothic king was killed and his forces scattered. This battle did not merely represent a military defeat. It signaled the collapse of centuries of Germanic rule and the opening of the Iberian Peninsula to Islamic governance. Following Guadalete, Muslim forces moved with astonishing speed. Within a decade, most of the peninsula south of the Duero River had come under Umayyad control. Cities and towns that had been Visigothic strongholds, Toledo, Córdoba, Seville, and Mérida, fell, often with minimal resistance. The conquerors employed a pragmatic approach to administration. They allowed local Christian and Jewish communities to continue practicing their religions in exchange for a tax, known as the jizya, while introducing a new bureaucratic order aligned with Islamic law. This system, which combined pragmatic governance with religious oversight, enabled the Umayyads to consolidate power without imposing a rigid uniformity that could have provoked widespread rebellion. Al-Andalus, as the region became known, was initially governed as a province of the Umayyad Caliphate of Damascus. The name itself, derived from the Arabic term for Iberia, reflected a new cultural and political era. Administrative centers, particularly Córdoba, were transformed into hubs of governance, trade, and intellectual life. Córdoba's selection as a provincial capital was strategic. Located in the Guadalquivir Valley, cultural transformation in Al-Andalus extended far beyond agriculture. Cities like Córdoba quickly became centers of learning, blending Islamic, Visigothic, and Roman traditions. Scholars translated Greek and Latin texts into Arabic, preserving classical knowledge while incorporating advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Early mosques, such as the Great Mosque of Córdoba, exemplified the fusion of architectural styles. Roman columns, Visigothic stonework, and Islamic artistry combined to create spaces of both worship and civic pride. This period also saw the development of Arabic as the lingua franca of administration, scholarship, and literature, providing a unifying medium across the diverse population. Despite the efficiency and cultural vibrancy of early Al-Andalus, resistance persisted, particularly in the northern mountainous regions of Asturias, Leon, and Cantabria. Here, small Christian polities, often led by remnants of the Visigothic elite, began organizing defenses that would later coalesce into the Christian Reconquista. Leaders such as Pelayo, who reputedly defeated a Muslim force at the Battle of Covadonga, circa 722 CE, became symbols of persistent resistance. These northern kingdoms remained fragmented and relatively minor in power compared to the growing Muslim territories, but their existence created a dynamic of ongoing conflict, negotiation, and cultural exchange that would shape Iberia for centuries. Trade and commerce flourished under Muslim rule, linking Al-Andalus to the wider Islamic world. Mediterranean ports facilitated exchange with North Africa, the Middle East, and even as far as India. Luxury goods, spices, ceramics, and textiles moved along well-maintained trade networks, while coinage standardized under the Umayyads facilitated commercial activity. Urban centers expanded, supported by a combination of Muslim settlers, converted locals, and indigenous Christian populations. Cities like Seville became vital nodes in both regional and trans-Mediterranean trade, generating wealth that funded further military campaigns and architectural projects. Early Al-Andalus also navigated the delicate balance of religious coexistence. Christians and Jews were recognized as dhimmis, protected communities who paid a tax in return for religious autonomy. This arrangement allowed for the preservation of Christian and Jewish institutions, including churches, synagogues, and schools, while integrating these communities into the economic and administrative life of the region. While social hierarchies were hierarchical and discrimination existed, the pragmatic tolerance of early Muslim rulers created a multi-layered society in which cultural and intellectual exchange flourished. Military organization in early Al-Andalus was sophisticated, ensuring both internal stability and external defense. Garrison towns were established in strategic locations, particularly along the frontiers with Christian-held northern territories. Berber troops, who had formed the backbone of the initial conquest, were stationed in key regions to maintain order, while Arab administrators coordinated taxation, law enforcement, and the collection of tribute. This dual approach of military presence and bureaucratic oversight allowed a relatively small ruling elite to govern a large, diverse territory efficiently. By the early 9th century, the foundations of what would become the Caliphate of Córdoba were being laid. Although nominally under the Umayyad Caliphate in Damascus, local governors began exercising increasing autonomy, particularly as the Abbasid Revolution in the Middle East redirected imperial attention away from Iberia. The early decades of Muslim rule had already transformed the peninsula, politically, culturally, and economically. Al-Andalus had become a distinct and influential region within the Mediterranean world. Its cities were vibrant, its fields productive, and its society a complex tapestry of Muslims, Christians, and Jews navigating a new order. The period from 711 to 929 was thus both a time of conquest and consolidation. The rapid military success of Muslim forces reshaped the Iberian Peninsula, but it was the subsequent administrative, cultural, and agricultural innovations that ensured the durability of Muslim rule. Al-Andalus was not merely a territory conquered. It became a living, evolving society, drawing on the legacies of Rome, the Visigoths, and North African Islamic traditions. These early centuries established patterns of urbanization, religious pluralism, intellectual exchange, and agricultural innovation that would define the region throughout the medieval period. In examining early Al-Andalus, one sees the duality of conquest and continuity, disruption and integration. Roman roads still connected cities, Visigothic structures were repurposed, and indigenous populations adapted to new rulers while contributing to the emerging social fabric. The peninsula had entered a new epoch where the legacies of prior civilizations blended with the innovations of a new imperial order. It was a land transformed, yet still familiar, a precursor to the remarkable flowering of culture, science, and governance that would characterize the Caliphate of Córdoba in the 10th century. By the early 10th century, the Iberian Peninsula had already witnessed dramatic transformations. The Muslim conquest had reshaped its political and cultural landscape, and early Al-Andalus had consolidated power under governors nominally tied to the Umayyad Caliphate in Damascus. Yet distant politics and internal dynamics were about to converge, giving rise to a period that would define medieval Iberia in its most dazzling form, the Caliphate of Córdoba. This era, beginning in 929 CE under Abd al-Rahman III, represented both the zenith of Islamic political power in Iberia and a cultural flowering that rivaled the great cities of the Muslim world, from Baghdad to Damascus. Abd al-Rahman III ascended to power in a turbulent environment. Al-Andalus had experienced decades of instability, with regional governors known as emirs asserting increasing autonomy. Threats from rebellious factions, internal strife among the Berber and Arab elites, and the lingering presence of Christian kingdoms in the north demanded strong leadership. Abd al-Rahman, a scion of the Umayyad dynasty that had survived the Abbasid overthrow in the east, seized upon his lineage to assert legitimacy, simultaneously projecting the authority of a caliphate independent of Baghdad. In 929, he proclaimed himself Caliph of Córdoba, elevating Al-Andalus from an emirate to a fully sovereign Islamic state, commanding respect and recognition across the Mediterranean and the Middle East. The consolidation of power was not merely symbolic. Abd al-Rahman III implemented sweeping administrative and military reforms that centralized authority and neutralized internal dissent. He reorganized the military into professional units, balancing Arab, Berber, and slave soldier contingents, while fortifying strategic cities and frontier posts. This professionalization allowed Al-Andalus to resist external threats from the Christian north and quell internal uprisings from ambitious governors. He also established a sophisticated bureaucracy, with a network of provincial administrators reporting directly to Córdoba, ensuring efficient tax collection and resource management. The Caliphate's administrative acumen made Córdoba a model of governance and stability in a period where much of Europe was fragmented into small, warring polities. Córdoba itself became a symbol of this power and sophistication. By the mid-10th century, it was among the largest cities in Europe, with estimates suggesting a population exceeding 200,000 inhabitants, rivaling contemporary Baghdad or Constantinople. The city's streets were lined with markets, mosques, palaces, baths, and gardens, a testament to the wealth and cosmopolitanism of the Caliphate. Most remarkable, perhaps, was its Great Mosque of Córdoba, expanded under Abd al-Rahman III and his successors. This architectural marvel combined Roman columns, Visigothic stonework, and innovative Islamic arches, reflecting centuries of cultural layering while creating a visual representation of a Umayyad grandeur and divine legitimacy. The Caliphate of Córdoba was also a center of learning and intellectual life. Its libraries, some claiming hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, preserved the classical knowledge of Greece and Rome while fostering original scholarship in fields such as mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and literature. Scholars in Córdoba engaged with works from Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, and beyond, translating Arabic, Greek, and Latin texts and synthesizing knowledge into new forms. The city attracted thinkers of all faiths. Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars interacted within its courts, schools, and mosques. Figures like Hasdai ibn Shaprut, a Jewish physician and diplomat, exemplified the remarkable intellectual cross-pollination of this era, serving as a cultural intermediary while advising the Caliphate on matters of science, diplomacy, and commerce. Economically, the Caliphate flourished through a combination of agricultural innovation, trade, and urbanization. The irrigation systems introduced during early Al-Andalus were expanded, with canals, dams, and water-lifting technologies turning previously culturally. The Caliphate of Córdoba represented a remarkable synthesis. Urban life combined Arabic architecture, Islamic artistic traditions, Roman and Visigothic legacies, and influences from Africa and the Middle East. Poetry and literature thrived, often reflecting both the courtly and the popular. Córdoba became a hub for artisans, calligraphers, and craftsmen whose works adorned palaces, mosques, and private homes. The Caliphate also managed a delicate religious balance. While Islam was the state religion, Christians and Jews were granted protected status as dhimmis, allowed to practice their faiths under specific conditions. This coexistence, while hierarchical, facilitated economic and intellectual collaboration across communities, contributing to the Caliphate's cosmopolitan character. Despite its internal strength, the Caliphate faced external challenges. To the north, Christian kingdoms such as Asturias, Leon, and Navarre slowly expanded their influence, engaging in raids, tribute negotiations, and occasional military campaigns. The Caliphate's response combined military expeditions with strategic diplomacy, balancing power across the Iberian Peninsula. The northern Christian territories, though fragmented, became the long-term counterweight that would eventually fuel the centuries-long Reconquista. Meanwhile, the Caliphate maintained communication and occasional alliances with the broader Islamic world, ensuring that Córdoba remained recognized as a legitimate and prestigious seat of power even as distant dynasties in North Africa and the Middle East faced their own upheavals. The political and military centralization achieved under Abd al-Rahman III allowed his successors to maintain dominance for decades. Al-Hakam II, r. 961 to 976, further expanded Córdoba's intellectual and cultural prominence, enlarging libraries, sponsoring translations, and commissioning architectural projects. Yet, even as the caliphate reached unprecedented heights, underlying structural vulnerabilities emerged. Succession crises, elite rivalries, and the challenges of governing a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society foreshadowed instability. The empire's vast wealth and sophistication, while sources of power, also attracted envy and fostered competition within the ruling elite. By the early 11th century, these tensions culminated in fragmentation. Following the death of Hisham II, r. 976 to 1009, and a series of short-lived rulers, the central authority of Córdoba weakened. Regional governors and local lords asserted independence, resulting in the division of the caliphate into multiple Taifa kingdoms by 1031. This political disintegration, though dramatic, did not erase the cultural and economic foundations laid during the caliphate's peak. The legacy of Córdoba, its urban planning, scholarship, agricultural systems, and artistic achievements endured, influencing subsequent Muslim and Christian polities throughout Iberia. The Caliphate of Córdoba exemplifies a paradox common in human history. The greater the brilliance of a civilization, the more vulnerable it becomes to internal decay. For 2 centuries, Córdoba had embodied the pinnacle of Muslim governance, culture, and intellectual life in Europe. Its libraries preserved classical knowledge, its scholars generated innovations, its markets circulated wealth, and its armies maintained order. Yet, even the mightiest city-state could not withstand the centrifugal forces of factionalism, dynastic intrigue, and regionalism indefinitely. When Córdoba fell into civil strife, the Iberian Peninsula entered a new era of political fragmentation, setting the stage for centuries of Taifa rivalries, Christian reconquest campaigns, and cultural synthesis. In retrospect, the Caliphate of Córdoba represents not merely a chapter in Spanish history, but a civilizational moment whose echoes resonate far beyond the Iberian Peninsula. Its intellectual, architectural, and cultural contributions shaped the medieval Mediterranean and laid the foundations for the European Renaissance. Córdoba's libraries and scholars preserved knowledge that would later flow northward, influencing Christian Europe after the eventual Reconquista. Its urban and agricultural innovations transformed landscapes and economies in ways that endured for generations. And politically, the Caliphate demonstrated both the heights of centralized Islamic governance in Europe and the inherent vulnerabilities of complex, multi-ethnic polities. The story of Córdoba reminds us that history is not merely a series of conquests and battles, but a dynamic interplay of culture, economy, religion, and human ambition. The Caliphate's rise and eventual fragmentation illustrate the transient nature of power and the enduring impact of cultural synthesis. By the end of the 10th century, Córdoba had reached a level of sophistication unparalleled in medieval Europe, yet it would soon enter a period of division and contestation, as emerging Taifa kingdoms vied for dominance and northern Christian realms began to reclaim territory. This sets the stage for the next chapter in Spanish history, the Reconquista, where Christian and Muslim forces would engage in centuries of warfare, negotiation, and coexistence, shaping the Iberian Peninsula's destiny for centuries to come. By the early 11th century, the Iberian Peninsula had entered a period of profound fragmentation. The mighty Caliphate of Córdoba, which for nearly 2 centuries had stood as a beacon of Islamic governance, culture, and intellectual achievement, had collapsed. Following the death of Hisham II and the succession crises that followed, the Caliphate splintered into a multitude of Taifa kingdoms, each ruled by local emirs, often former governors or generals. Cities such as Seville, Toledo, Zaragoza, Valencia, and Granada became independent polities, fiercely competing for territory, tribute, and prestige. While these smaller kingdoms retained the cultural and economic advancements of Cordoba's vibrant markets, irrigation systems, sophisticated architecture, and flourishing scholarship, they were politically vulnerable. The political fragmentation of Al-Andalus provided a unique opportunity for the Christian kingdoms of northern Iberia, which had survived the Muslim conquest in their mountainous refuges, to begin a process that would span centuries. The Reconquista, the reconquest of the peninsula by Christian forces. The northern Christian realms, shaped by geography and resilience, had maintained their autonomy through a combination of military vigilance and strategic isolation. The Kingdom of Asturias, established in the aftermath of the Battle of Covadonga in 722, had become a nucleus of Christian resistance. Its rulers, descendants of the Visigothic elite, nurtured an identity rooted in Visigothic traditions, Christian faith, and opposition to Muslim rule. Over time, Asturias expanded, absorbing territories and evolving into the Kingdom of Leon by the 10th century. Similarly, the Kingdom of Navarre, centered around the Pyrenees, and the County of Castile, initially a frontier march under Leon, developed political and military structures designed to survive in a hostile, fragmented peninsula. These northern polities were modest in size but rich in strategic resolve, serving as both refuges and launching points for reconquest campaigns. The early Reconquista was not a linear march of Christian armies southward, but a complex interplay of warfare, diplomacy, and alliances. Christian kings exploited divisions among the Taifa kingdoms, sometimes paying tribute, known as parias, to secure temporary peace or gain an advantage over rivals. The Taifas, in turn, often hired Christian mercenaries to fight against neighboring Muslim rivals, highlighting the pragmatic, transactional nature of medieval politics. These parias were more than military expedients. They injected substantial wealth into northern kingdoms, enabling rulers to fund armies, fortifications, and administrative infrastructure. In many ways, the Reconquista of this period was as much a political and economic maneuver as it was a religious or ideological struggle. Throughout the 11th century, territorial gains were gradual but cumulative. Christian forces captured key strategic cities and fortresses, establishing footholds that would later serve as bases for expansion. Notably, the capture of Toledo in 1085 by Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile represented a watershed moment. Toledo, a city of immense historical significance, had been a center of Muslim administration, culture, and learning. Its fall provided Christians with a critical urban base in central Iberia, access to fertile lands, and control over trade routes. The conquest of Toledo also brought a treasure trove of knowledge, including libraries and manuscripts, which would influence Christian scholars and help lay the intellectual groundwork for later European engagement with classical and Islamic learning. The military campaigns of this period were shaped by geography, technology, and strategy. Northern forces, often mounted and mobile, relied on swift raids into Muslim-held territories. Castles, mountain passes, and river valleys were vital tactical considerations. Christian armies combined traditional infantry with cavalry capable of rapid maneuver, exploiting both the rugged terrain and the fractured political. The 12th century saw a new phase of consolidation and coordination among Christian kingdoms. Castile, Leon, Aragon, and Navarre strengthened their dynastic alliances through marriages, treaties, and shared military campaigns. Regional rulers increasingly centralized power, enhanced administrative structures, and codified laws to stabilize governance in territories newly acquired from Muslim control. The development of parochial organization, town councils, consejos, and fortified settlements facilitated both defense and social integration. Economically, the Reconquista stimulated agricultural development, urbanization, and trade. Northern ports on the Atlantic and Mediterranean expanded, while inland towns grew into economic hubs, benefiting from the influx of settlers, craftsmen, and merchants migrating southward. Religion continued to play a central role in shaping political and cultural identity during the Reconquista. The Christian kingdoms invoked religious legitimacy to justify military campaigns, framing the reconquest as a sacred duty to reclaim lands under Islamic rule. Monasteries and ecclesiastical institutions proliferated, serving as centers of learning, record-keeping, and spiritual authority. Religious symbolism, such as banners, rituals, and patron saints, unified armies and reinforced societal cohesion. Simultaneously, Christian rulers often adopted pragmatic policies toward Muslim populations in reconquered areas, allowing them to remain as mudehars, maintaining Islamic religious practices in exchange for loyalty and taxation. This created a layered, multi-religious society in which cultural exchange and coexistence continued to influence the peninsula's identity. The Reconquista also reached an inflection point with the emergence of larger, more coordinated military engagements. One of the most decisive occurred at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212, marking a turning point in the Christian reconquest. A coalition of Christian kings, including Alfonso VIII of Castile, Pedro II of Aragon, and Sancho VII of Navarre, assembled an army to confront the Almohad Caliphate, which had replaced the fragmented taifas in southern Iberia. The battle demonstrated both the growing military sophistication of the Christian kingdoms and the strategic vulnerability of even the most powerful Muslim forces in Iberia. Las Navas de Tolosa shattered Almohad dominance, opening vast territories to subsequent Christian expansion and signaling the beginning of the end for Muslim political hegemony in much of the peninsula. The period between 1031 and 1212 thus represents the initial flowering of the Reconquista, characterized by military maneuvering, political pragmatism, cultural synthesis, and gradual Christian consolidation. It was neither a monolithic crusade nor a simple narrative of conquest. Instead, it was a centuries-long, dynamic process in which alliances shifted, territories changed hands repeatedly, and coexistence coexisted with conflict. The Reconquista's early phase laid the groundwork for the eventual unification of Spain under the Catholic monarchs, while also shaping the social, cultural, and religious tapestry of medieval Iberia. Economically, this era also transformed the peninsula. Reconquered lands were redistributed to military elites and settlers, promoting agricultural production and urban growth. Innovations in irrigation and farming, inherited from centuries of Muslim presence, were preserved and expanded, enhancing productivity. Trade networks linking northern and southern Iberia, as well as connections across the Mediterranean, were reactivated. Coins circulated more widely, markets flourished, and cities like Toledo, Burgos, and Leon became centers of commerce and administration. This period of economic revitalization was inseparable from military and political developments, as stability enabled population growth, urban expansion, and cultural exchange. In conclusion, the early Reconquista was a complex, multifaceted process that redefined the Iberian Peninsula. Christian kingdoms, emerging from the shadow of Visigothic and Asturian survival, exploited the political fragmentation of Al-Andalus to consolidate power, expand territory, and integrate diverse populations. Warfare, diplomacy, economic development, and cultural exchange intertwined to create a dynamic medieval society. By the time of the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212, the Christian kingdoms had gained the strategic and symbolic momentum that would carry the Reconquista through the next 2 centuries, culminating in the eventual conquest of Granada in 1492. Yet even in these early stages, the peninsula's history was marked by a delicate interplay of conquest and coexistence, demonstrating that the Iberian Peninsula's identity was forged as much through cultural synthesis and negotiation as through martial triumph. The Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212 was more than a military victory. It was a turning point that reshaped the Iberian Peninsula. Christian forces, united under Alfonso VIII of Castile, Pedro II of Aragon, and Sancho VII of Navarre, had delivered a decisive blow to the Almohad Caliphate. Their triumph not only shattered Almohad power, but also opened a path for southern expansion, marking the transition from fragmented Christian gains to a sustained, systematic campaign known as the Late Reconquista. Over the next 3 centuries, this period would witness the steady Christian reconquest of the peninsula, culminating in the fall of Granada in 1492, the final Muslim stronghold, while simultaneously laying the foundation for the emergence of a unified Spanish state. The 13th century saw the northern Christian kingdoms, particularly Castile and Aragon, consolidate and expand. Alfonso IX of Leon and Ferdinand III of Castile pursued campaigns that captured key cities in Andalusia, including Córdoba in 1236 and Seville in 1248. These victories were achieved not solely through brute force, but through careful siegecraft, diplomacy, and strategic alliances. Muslim rulers, often fragmented and weakened by internal rivalries among the Taifas and the enduring threat of North African dynasties, struggled to maintain unity. The Christian advance exploited these divisions, systematically annexing territories and integrating them into the expanding Castilian and Aragonese realms. The integration of reconquered territories was complex. Cities like Córdoba and Seville retained elements of Muslim administration and urban planning even as Christian institutions took root. Christian monarchs allowed Muslim populations to remain as mudehars, preserving their religious and social practices under strict regulations and tribute obligations. This pragmatic approach minimized rebellion while sustaining economic productivity. Muslim artisans, engineers, and farmers continued to contribute to local economies, particularly in agriculture and urban infrastructure, ensuring that the benefits of the reconquest extended beyond mere territorial acquisition. The coexistence, however hierarchical and fragile, maintained a cultural and technological continuum that would influence Spanish society for centuries. The political landscape of the peninsula was also shaped by the growing influence of dynastic unions and marriage alliances. In the Kingdom of Aragon, rulers expanded influence into the Mediterranean, while Castilian monarchs focused on the southern reconquest. Over time, intermarriage between ruling houses, including between Castile and Aragon, became a strategic tool to consolidate power, neutralize rivalries, and coordinate military campaigns. These alliances not only strengthened Christian consolidation, but also facilitated the eventual unification of Spain under Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile in the late 15th century, a union that would transform the peninsula's political trajectory. The military campaigns of the late Reconquista were marked by a combination of siege warfare, cavalry raids, and protracted negotiations. Siegecraft evolved significantly, incorporating both engineering innovations and psychological tactics. Castles, fortified towns, and strategic river crossings became focal points of control. Christian forces, increasingly organized into professional armies with logistical support and hierarchical command structures, gradually overcame the fragmented Muslim defenses. In contrast, Muslim polities, though culturally and economically sophisticated, struggled to coordinate effective resistance against these increasingly centralized and resourceful Christian forces. Economically, the late Reconquista reshaped Andalusia and other southern regions. Fertile plains, previously irrigated and cultivated by Muslim engineers, were integrated into Christian domains. Land redistribution often favored military elites and settlers loyal to the crown, facilitating both governance and agricultural expansion. Urban centers were revitalized as administrative hubs, markets, and centers of trade. Córdoba, Seville, and Granada retained vibrant commercial networks, linking inland production with Mediterranean trade routes. The economic integration of these territories was essential not only for sustaining further military campaigns, but also for funding the emerging ambitions of the unified Spanish monarchy. Religious and cultural transformations intensified during this period. Christian rulers actively promoted the spread of Catholicism, establishing dioceses, constructing churches, and supporting monastic institutions. Monastic orders, including the Cistercians and Franciscans, played a pivotal role in education, record-keeping, and cultural consolidation. At the same time, the political strategies of Granada included diplomacy, tribute, and military alliances. Nasrid rulers occasionally allied with North African dynasties to counterbalance Christian expansion while maintaining internal governance. Despite being the last Muslim stronghold, Granada's stability allowed for a remarkable continuation of intellectual and artistic life. Scholars, poets, engineers, and artisans thrived under Nasrid patronage, contributing to fields ranging from astronomy and medicine to poetry and decorative arts. This cultural vibrancy persisted even as the Christian reconquest pressed inexorably forward, highlighting the complexity and resilience of Al-Andalus during its final centuries. The 15th century brought the culmination of centuries of Reconquista efforts. The union of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile in 1469 unified two of the most powerful Christian kingdoms, providing the political, military, and economic coordination necessary for the final campaigns against Granada. Over the subsequent 2 decades, a combination of siege warfare, strategic encirclement, and attrition gradually eroded Nasrid resistance. Granada's fall in 1492 marked the end of Muslim political power in Iberia, concluding a nearly 8th-century presence that had profoundly influenced the peninsula's culture, architecture, agriculture, and intellectual life. 1492 was a year of extraordinary transformation beyond the Reconquista. The completion of the Christian reconquest coincided with Christopher Columbus's voyage westward, sponsored by Ferdinand and Isabella, signaling the dawn of Spain's imperial era. Simultaneously, the Spanish crown issued the Alhambra Decree, mandating the expulsion of Jews who refused conversion to Christianity. These intertwined events, territorial unification, religious consolidation, and global exploration, reflected a decisive shift in Spanish identity. A kingdom no longer divided by internal fragmentation, but defined by religious uniformity, centralized authority, and imperial ambition. The late Reconquista left enduring legacies across Iberia. Politically, it facilitated the emergence of a centralized monarchy capable of projecting power beyond its borders. Militarily, it demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated campaigns, professionalized armies, and strategic alliances. Economically, the integration of fertile southern lands and vibrant urban centers provided the resources necessary for Spain's forthcoming expansion into the Americas. Culturally, centuries of Islamic influence persisted in architecture, agriculture, language, and scholarship, creating a hybridized society whose imprint can still be observed in modern Spain. Furthermore, the social dynamics established during this period coexistence, conversion, and assimilation shaped the contours of Spanish society. Mudéjar communities, forced conversions, and the eventual consolidation of Catholic orthodoxy under Ferdinand and Isabella illustrate the complex interplay of pragmatism, coercion, and cultural synthesis that characterized late medieval Iberia. These dynamics also set the stage for subsequent policies under the Spanish monarchy, including the establishment of the Spanish Inquisition, the consolidation of regional authority, and the pursuit of a global empire. The fall of Granada and the completion of the Reconquista thus represent both an endpoint and a beginning. The peninsula was politically unified under Christian rule, but its culture, economy, and society had been profoundly shaped by centuries of interaction between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. The late Reconquista exemplifies the intertwining of military ambition, religious ideology, political pragmatism, and cultural continuity, a period in which Spain's identity, both contested and constructed, began to crystallize in preparation for its emergence as a European and global power. By 1492, the Iberian Peninsula had been transformed irrevocably. The once fractured Christian kingdoms had absorbed centuries of Muslim territory, securing strategic cities, fertile lands, and economic networks. Granada's fall marked the culmination of a centuries-long effort of conquest, diplomacy, and cultural negotiation. Yet the legacy of Al-Andalus persisted in the landscape, architecture, agricultural systems, and intellectual traditions. Spain's unification under Ferdinand and Isabella combined with the expansion into the Americas heralded a new era in which the lessons, innovations, and conflicts of the Reconquista would continue to shape the trajectory of a nation destined for global influence. The fall of Granada in 1492 was not merely the culmination of centuries of Christian reconquest. It was the prelude to a transformation that would propel Spain onto the global stage. With the Iberian Peninsula politically unified under Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, Spain transitioned from a collection of medieval kingdoms into a centralized, ambitious monarchy capable of projecting power far beyond Europe. The unification provided the political, military, and financial foundation necessary to embark upon ventures that would reshape the world. Central to this transformation was Spain's embrace of exploration. Columbus's voyage in 1492, though aimed at reaching the Indies, resulted instead in the European discovery of the Americas, a land rich in resources and civilizations unknown to Europe. This event marked the beginning of Spain's global expansion, a campaign driven by both economic motives and religious imperatives, blending trade, conquest, and missionary zeal into a single, coherent imperial strategy. The discovery of the New World provided Spain with opportunities for unprecedented wealth and influence, laying the foundation for an empire whose scale would dwarf its European rivals. Spain's imperial ambitions were immediately followed by conquest and colonization, a process both rapid and transformative. Hernán Cortés, in 1519, led a campaign against the Aztec Empire in present-day Mexico, exploiting internal divisions, forming alliances with disaffected indigenous groups, and leveraging superior military technology to achieve a stunning victory by 1521. Cortés' conquest brought enormous quantities of gold, silver, and other resources to Spain, establishing a template for future expeditions, strategic alliances, decisive battles, and administrative incorporation of conquered territories into a centralized colonial framework. Similarly, Francisco Pizarro's conquest of the Inca Empire in 1532 demonstrated the application of these strategies in South America, consolidating Spanish dominance over vast resource-rich regions and establishing Lima as the new administrative capital of the Viceroyalty of Peru. The wealth extracted from the Americas fundamentally altered Spain's economy and European politics. Silver from mines such as Potosi and gold from Mexico flowed across the Atlantic, fueling commerce, state revenue, and military expenditure. Spain became the wealthiest kingdom in Europe, its coffers swelling to support armies, navies, and ambitious political projects. This influx of resources, however, also introduced new challenges: inflation, reliance on colonial extraction, and the complex logistics of administering territories across oceans. Nevertheless, the early 16th century saw Spain exercising unprecedented influence, both as a European power and as a transoceanic empire stretching from the Caribbean to the Pacific. Spain's imperial expansion was not limited to the Americas. Its European and Mediterranean policies reflected a strategic vision shaped by the dynastic ambitions of Charles I of Spain, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. Charles inherited a complex web of territories, the Iberian kingdoms, the Burgundian Netherlands, and claims across Italy and the Holy Roman Empire. This combination of inheritance and conquest positioned Spain at the center of European politics, where its military, diplomatic, and financial resources could shape continental outcomes. Meanwhile, in the Americas, colonial expansion continued, with the establishment of cities, fortifications, and administrative centers designed to integrate newly conquered territories into the Spanish crown. Colonial governance was structured through viceroyalties, with viceroys acting as the king's representatives, administering justice, collecting taxes, and overseeing trade. The introduction of institutions such as the audiencias ensured that both civil and ecclesiastical authority were intertwined with imperial objectives, consolidating Spanish control over vast and diverse populations. Religion played a central role in Spain's imperial identity. Catholicism, already solidified as the state religion of the unified Iberian Peninsula, became the ideological backbone of colonial expansion. Missionary activity, spearheaded by orders such as the Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuits, sought to convert indigenous populations to Christianity. Conversion efforts were intertwined with governance, as religious authority reinforced the legitimacy of Spanish rule. Churches, missions, and religious schools were established across the Americas, blending spiritual objectives with cultural and administrative control. Catholicism, however, the early Spanish Empire was also marked by conflict, exploitation, and resistance. Indigenous populations faced profound disruptions, including forced labor systems such as the encomienda, exposure to European diseases, and displacement from ancestral lands. Rebellions and resistance movements emerged across the Americas, challenging Spanish authority and forcing adaptations in governance and military strategy. The empire's early decades were thus a complex interplay of conquest, coercion, negotiation, and cultural synthesis, demonstrating both the extraordinary capacity of Spain to project power and the human cost of imperial ambition. Economically, Spain relied heavily on the wealth extracted from its colonies, yet it also established trade networks linking Europe, Africa, and Asia. The Spanish crown maintained control over transatlantic commerce, regulating the shipment of silver, gold, and goods through ports such as Seville. These networks positioned Spain at the heart of global trade in the early modern period, with influence extending to Africa through the slave trade and to Asia via the Philippines and the Manila Galleon. The empire's economic reach underscored the interconnectedness of its domains, where European consumption, colonial production, and transoceanic exchange formed a single, interdependent system. The reign of Charles I, Charles V, exemplified the complexities of early empire building, balancing European dynastic politics, transatlantic administration, military campaigns, and religious leadership as defender of Catholic Christendom. His abdication in 1556, dividing his territories between his son Philip II in Spain and the Low Countries and his brother Ferdinand in the Holy Roman Empire, reflected both the scale of Spanish power and the difficulties inherent in maintaining such a vast multi-continental empire. Nonetheless, the foundations laid during this period, from conquest and colonization to administration and cultural integration, ensured that Spain would remain a dominant global power for decades to come. By the mid-16th century, Spain had transitioned from a unified Iberian kingdom into a global empire, commanding territories across the Americas, Europe, and the Pacific. This transformation reflected the culmination of centuries of political consolidation, military innovation, religious zeal, and economic ambition. The early Spanish Empire's achievements, its conquests, wealth, administration, and cultural influence set new standards for European imperialism and reshaped the geopolitical landscape of the early modern world. Spain's power was unparalleled, its influence felt in every corner of Europe and the Americas, and its empire served as both a model and a challenge for rival powers in the centuries that followed. The era from 1492 to 1556 thus represents the birth of Spain as a global power, an empire whose scope, wealth, and influence were unprecedented in European history. It was a period of ambition and innovation, of conquest and administration, of cultural transplantation and exchange. The Spanish Empire emerged not merely from military victories, but from a sophisticated combination of political centralization, religious legitimacy, economic extraction, and cultural integration. In these decades, Spain transitioned from a regional European kingdom into the preeminent power of the 16th century, establishing the foundations for what would become one of the largest and most influential empires the world had ever seen. In 1556, the young Philip II inherited a realm of unparalleled magnitude: Spain, the Netherlands, territories in Italy, the nascent empire in the Americas, and a global maritime presence that spanned from the Caribbean to the Philippines. Philip's accession marked the beginning of the Habsburg Golden Age, a period when Spain reached its peak of political, military, economic, and cultural influence, even as the strains of overextension, religious absolutism, and dynastic ambition began to sow the seeds of future decline. Philip II's Spain was the preeminent Catholic power of Europe, asserting its authority as the bulwark of Christendom. This religious identity was central to Spanish governance, influencing domestic policy, foreign affairs, and imperial administration. Philip embraced counter-Reformation zeal, working in close alliance with the Catholic Church to enforce orthodoxy and suppress heresy. The Spanish Inquisition, though instituted earlier, became an instrument of state power during his reign, ensuring conformity, consolidating political authority, and regulating both social and religious life. Protestantism was regarded not merely as a theological challenge, but as a political threat, particularly in the rebellious provinces of the Low Countries, where tensions between religious freedom, local autonomy, and imperial control erupted into open conflict. The military ambitions of Spain under Philip II were both expansive and relentless. In Europe, he defended Habsburg territories, engaged in wars against France, and sought to suppress Protestant uprisings. One of the most celebrated episodes of his reign, the Spanish Armada of 1588, sought to challenge England and restore Catholic supremacy. Though the Armada was ultimately defeated, the campaign epitomized Spain's global reach and its willingness to commit vast resources to defend faith, dynasty, and empire. Beyond Europe, Spain's military might projected into the Americas, where conquistadors, colonial administrators, and viceroys maintained order and expanded territorial claims. The empire's armies, galleons, and fortresses symbolized the capacity of a single kingdom to wield power across continents. Spain's economic structure under the Habsburgs was both a source of strength and a cause of fragility. Wealth from the Americas, particularly silver from mines such as Potosi and Zacatecas, financed military campaigns, built monumental architecture, and supported an expansive bureaucracy. The influx of bullion allowed Spain to dominate European financial networks, but it also introduced systemic vulnerabilities. Inflation, reliance on imported wealth, and the costs of maintaining far-flung territories strained the domestic economy. Agricultural production, particularly in Castile, struggled to meet internal demand, while industrial development lagged relative to Northern Europe. Despite these challenges, the Habsburgs harnessed imperial revenues to sustain their global ambitions, creating an empire whose wealth and influence were unparalleled. Culturally, the Habsburg Golden Age is remembered as a period of extraordinary artistic and intellectual achievement. The era produced luminaries whose works defined Spanish identity and influenced European culture. El Greco, with his ethereal, elongated forms and spiritual intensity, transformed religious art, capturing the tension between divine aspiration and earthly experience. Miguel de Cervantes, writing during the early 17th century, produced Don Quixote, a literary masterpiece that interrogated chivalric ideals, social transformation, and the human condition, blending humor, realism, and philosophical insight. Architectural and artistic patronage flourished under Philip II and his successors, exemplified by monumental constructions such as El Escorial, a sprawling palace, monastery, and mausoleum that symbolized both royal authority and Catholic piety. Across painting, literature, and architecture, Spain asserted cultural dominance as confidently as it did military or political influence. Despite these achievements, the empire faced mounting internal and external pressures. Spain's vast territories were difficult to govern, communication across oceans was slow, and local elites in Europe and the Americas often resisted central authority. Military overextension led to protracted conflicts, draining resources and destabilizing finances. Dynastic succession became increasingly precarious, with Habsburg rulers marrying within a limited familial pool, producing heirs with chronic health issues and intensifying the risk of political fragmentation. By the late 16th century, Spain's preeminence, though dazzling, was balanced by structural vulnerabilities that would later contribute to decline. Religiously, Spain's assertive Catholic identity influenced its international posture. The Habsburgs championed the Counter-Reformation in Europe, sponsoring missions, funding the arts to inspire devotion, and intervening diplomatically or militarily against Protestant or Ottoman adversaries. This ideological commitment extended to the Americas, where missionary orders sought to convert indigenous populations, often incorporating local knowledge and labor systems. Religious institutions were intertwined with colonial administration, serving both spiritual and practical functions in governance, education, and cultural assimilation. Faith became inseparable from political legitimacy, underpinning Spanish authority at home and abroad. In the Mediterranean, Spain sought to secure trade routes, defend against Ottoman expansion, and project maritime power. Naval engagements, fortified ports, and galleon fleets were central to imperial strategy. While the defeat of the Armada in 1588 is often highlighted as a setback, it was part of a broader pattern of naval competition that underscored Spain's strategic ambitions and its capacity to mobilize resources on a global scale. Spanish naval dominance facilitated trade, the transport of precious metals, and military interventions, ensuring that Spain remained a central player in European and transatlantic affairs. The empire's social fabric was shaped by a hierarchical structure deeply economically. Spain's golden age was paradoxical. The wealth flowing from the Americas financed grandeur and military dominance, yet dependence on precious metals, coupled with mismanagement and inflation, created vulnerabilities. Agriculture and industry lagged, prompting reliance on imports and foreign expertise. Spanish coinage circulated across Europe, influencing markets and trade networks, but fiscal challenges persisted, including multiple state bankruptcies under Philip II and Philip III. These economic pressures revealed that imperial wealth could be both empowering and destabilizing, a duality that would characterize Spain's trajectory in the 17th century. The Habsburg Golden Age also witnessed the flourishing of intellectual life and scholarship. Universities, convents, and courts became centers for the study of law, theology, astronomy, and medicine. The intellectual ferment was influenced by humanism, Renaissance thought, and interaction with Islamic knowledge preserved in Spain. Figures such as Juan de Mariana and Francisco de Vitoria contributed to early modern political theory, legal philosophy, and discussions of sovereignty, colonial rights, and international law. These contributions reflected Spain's role not only as a military and economic power, but also as a crucible of ideas with global resonance. Yet, beneath the grandeur, signs of strain were increasingly evident. Military overreach, fiscal stress, and succession vulnerabilities foreshadowed decline. The empire's vastness, once a symbol of unparalleled power, became a liability, creating logistical, administrative, and financial challenges. Regional elites, local identities, and colonial complexities tested the cohesion of the state. By the end of the 17th century, Spain remained a cultural, religious, and military beacon, but the limitations of its system, the consequences of centralized absolutism, reliance on imperial wealth, and dynastic fragility began to manifest, setting the stage for the Bourbon reforms and eventual restructuring of Spanish governance in the 18th century. The Habsburg Golden Age represents a paradox: unparalleled achievement in politics, art, literature, religion, and global influence. Yet the seeds of decline were sown within the very structures that created it. Spain under Philip II and his successors exemplified the zenith of early modern monarchy, an empire whose wealth, culture, and reach inspired awe and fear alike. The period was marked by triumph and grandeur, as well as the underlying tensions of an overextended, rigidly hierarchical, and fiscally stressed empire. It was a time when Spain's identity, power, and ambition reached their historical pinnacle, even as the challenges of sustaining that dominance began to emerge. By 1700, the death of the last Habsburg monarch, Charles II, left the throne without an heir, precipitating a dynastic crisis that would ultimately lead to the War of Spanish Succession. The Golden Age had left Spain with an extraordinary legacy of culture, architecture, scholarship, and imperial presence, but the empire's structural weaknesses were now exposed. These weaknesses, economic strain, military overextension, dynastic vulnerability, and administrative complexity, would dominate the narrative of the 18th century, as Spain transitioned from Habsburg to Bourbon rule, seeking to reconcile its grandiose past with the imperatives of modern governance. The Habsburg Golden Age is thus a period of extremes: unmatched artistic, religious, and imperial achievement on one hand, and the structural contradictions of overextension, fiscal dependence, and rigid absolutism on the other. It was an era in which Spain reached the height of its influence and power, leaving a legacy that continues to define the historical imagination of a nation and a continent. The achievements, failures, and transformations of this period would shape the trajectory of Spain's subsequent political, cultural, and imperial evolution, setting the stage for the Bourbon reforms and the Enlightenment that would follow. The dawn of the 18th century ushered in a period of profound transformation for Spain. The death of the last Habsburg monarch, Charles II, in 1700 ended an era and plunged Spain into the War of Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714. Competing claims to the throne, primarily between the Bourbon Philip V and Habsburg Archduke Charles of Austria, drew in much of Europe. The conflict concluded with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, affirming Philip V as King of Spain, but ceding territories in Europe, such as the Spanish Netherlands, Naples, Milan, and Gibraltar, to rival powers. While a political compromise, the ascension of the Bourbon dynasty inaugurated a new phase of governance, characterized by centralization, modernization, and reform, laying the groundwork for Spain's adaptation to the evolving European and global order. Philip V, the first Bourbon king of Spain, faced the challenge of consolidating a fragmented monarchy. The Habsburg system had allowed regional autonomy, particularly in Catalonia, Aragon, and Valencia, but Bourbon reforms aimed to strengthen central authority, streamline administration, and enforce uniformity in law and taxation. These policies, influenced by the French model of absolutism, sought to integrate Spain's diverse territories into a cohesive state, enhancing the monarchy's capacity to respond to domestic and international challenges. Administrative reforms included the creation of intendants, officials responsible for supervising fiscal collection, military recruitment, and local governance, thus reducing the power of local elites and increasing royal oversight. Economically, the Bourbon monarchy implemented reforms to revitalize Spain's finances and enhance imperial profitability. The Reformas Borbónicas aimed to modernize agriculture, stimulate commerce, and reorganize colonial administration. In the Americas, Spain reorganized its viceroyalties, created new audiencia courts, and strengthened control over trade, reducing contraband and ensuring that revenues flowed more directly to the crown. The Bourbon monopoly on colonial trade channeled wealth through designated ports such as Seville and Cadiz, while administrative oversight expanded to regulate the flow of silver, gold, and goods from the New World. These reforms sought to reverse economic stagnation, curb corruption, and strengthen Spain's position as a European and global power. The Bourbon reforms were also shaped by the intellectual currents of the Enlightenment. Spanish thinkers, inspired by rationalism, empiricism, and reformist ideas circulating across Europe, advocated for educational modernization, scientific advancement, and secular governance. Figures such as Gaspar Melchor de Jovellanos and José Cid also called for legal codification, agricultural innovation, and infrastructural development, reflecting a growing recognition that Spain needed to embrace reason, efficiency, and modernization to maintain its influence. Enlightenment ideas influenced both domestic policy and colonial administration, encouraging reforms that balanced absolutist centralization with pragmatic improvements in governance, economy, and society. Military reform was central to Bourbon ambitions. Spain's armed forces, previously weakened by the overextension of the Habsburg era, were restructured and modernized. Infantry, cavalry, and artillery were reorganized under professional standards, fortifications were improved, and the Navy received significant investment to protect overseas territories and trade routes. These measures were critical to sustaining Spain's remaining empire, particularly in the Americas, where European rivals and local resistance required both vigilance and the capacity for rapid deployment. Military modernization was inseparable from administrative and fiscal reform, reflecting the integrated approach of the Bourbons in consolidating state power. Colonial administration underwent significant restructuring under the Bourbons. Spain's American territories were divided into viceroyalties, each overseen by a viceroy representing royal authority. The introduction of intendants and tighter bureaucratic oversight reduced the autonomy of local elites, curtailed corruption, and increased efficiency in tax collection and governance. Trade regulations were enforced more strictly, and ports were better organized to facilitate economic integration. These reforms strengthened the monarchy's ability to extract resources while ensuring that colonial territories were directly accountable to Madrid rather than local oligarchies. The result was a more centralized and profitable imperial system, capable of supporting military and economic ambitions on a global scale. Culturally, the Bourbon era fostered a flourishing of arts, architecture, and education, reflecting both Enlightenment ideals and royal patronage. Cities were modernized, academies were established, and infrastructure projects improved transportation, commerce, and administration. The royal court in Madrid became a center of political, cultural, and intellectual life, attracting scholars, artists, and reformers. Architectural projects, such as the Royal Palace of Madrid, embodied the grandeur and authority of the Bourbon monarchy, while educational reforms sought to expand literacy, legal knowledge, and scientific understanding among elites. These efforts were intended not only to glorify the crown, but to strengthen the intellectual and administrative capacity of the state. Despite these reforms, Spain faced persistent internal and external challenges. Regional identities, deeply rooted in history and local governance structures, sometimes resisted centralization, leading to tension in Catalonia, Aragon, and the Basque territories. Economic disparities, social stratification, and corruption continued to impede full modernization, while European rivals Britain, France, and the Netherlands competed fiercely for global influence, particularly in the Americas and Asia. Spain's imperial ambitions were constrained by the need to defend territories, maintain naval supremacy, and manage complex colonial logistics, revealing that even enlightened absolutism had inherent limits. The interplay of Enlightenment thought and Bourbon reform also influenced social policy. Legal codification sought to standardize justice across the kingdom, while efforts to improve agriculture and commerce aimed to enhance the livelihoods of both rural and urban populations. Education reforms promoted rationalist thinking, scientific inquiry, and practical knowledge, equipping administrators, military officers, and professionals with skills necessary to manage a sprawling empire. The emphasis on rational governance, economic productivity, and social improvement reflected the Enlightenment conviction that informed policy could create stronger, more prosperous states capable of competing on the international stage. Internationally, Spain's position remained precarious despite its reforms. The loss of European territories after the War of Spanish Succession had curtailed continental influence, while rival powers challenged Spanish supremacy in trade and colonial affairs. Naval competition with Britain and France intensified, particularly in the Caribbean and Pacific, highlighting the vulnerabilities inherent in managing a global empire. Spain's response combined military investment, administrative efficiency, and diplomatic engagement, seeking to preserve imperial holdings and maintain strategic advantages despite relative economic and technological disadvantages compared to emerging European powers. The Bourbon reforms also had profound implications for colonial society. Indigenous populations and local elites navigated tighter imperial oversight, new trade regulations, and shifts in administrative authority. While some reforms, such as improvements in taxation, infrastructure, and legal codification, enhanced efficiency and stability, they also generated resistance. Revolts and localized unrest occasionally erupted, reflecting tensions between imperial authority and local interests. The Spanish crown's ability to manage these dynamics through a combination of coercion, negotiation, and institutional control demonstrates the complexity of governance across diverse and distant territories. The period from 1700 to 1808 thus represents a critical era of adaptation, modernization, and consolidation. The Bourbon reforms sought to reconcile Spain's historical grandeur with the practical demands of governance, economics, and military power in an increasingly competitive Europe. By integrating Enlightenment principles with absolutist centralization, the monarchy attempted to create a more efficient, resilient, and globally competitive state. Administrative, fiscal, military, and cultural reforms strengthened the monarchy and the empire, while also exposing the limits of centralized power in managing diverse territories and populations. The Bourbon era laid the foundations for Spain's trajectory in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. While the reforms could not reverse all structural weaknesses, they modernized key aspects of governance, military capability, and economic management. Spain emerged as a more centralized and administratively coherent state, capable of projecting power across the Atlantic and sustaining its imperial presence, even as external pressures and internal limitations foreshadowed challenges to come. The Bourbon reforms reflect a conscious effort to apply rational governance, economic regulation, and cultural patronage to the complex realities of empire, demonstrating both the promise and the constraints of enlightened absolutism. By the early 19th century, the Bourbon legacy would be tested by war, revolution, and colonial independence movements, as Spain struggled to retain its territories and influence in a rapidly changing world. Yet the period from 1700 to 1808 stands as a testament to the monarchy's capacity for adaptation, strategic governance, and cultural patronage, preserving Spain's relevance on the European and global stage despite prior decline. The Bourbon reforms and Enlightenment influence exemplify a period in which Spain sought to balance tradition with innovation, central authority with efficiency, and imperial ambition with practical governance, a complex and pivotal chapter in the story of Spain's enduring history. The dawn of the 19th century brought Spain to the precipice of transformation. The Bourbon monarchy, still struggling to consolidate power after centuries of Habsburg decline and Bourbon reform, faced an unprecedented crisis with the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1808, Napoleon's ambitions extended into the Iberian Peninsula, exploiting dynastic weakness and political fragmentation. The forced abdication of Charles IV and his son Ferdinand VII, orchestrated by French intervention, triggered the Peninsular War, a conflict that would define Spain's struggle for sovereignty, identity, and modern governance. Napoleon's invasion was swift and devastating. French forces entered Spain under the guise of protecting the monarchy, but swiftly occupied major cities, including Madrid. The Spanish population, however, resisted fiercely, giving rise to one of history's earliest examples of modern guerrilla warfare. Irregular militias, local volunteers, and regional armies harassed French supply lines, ambushed detachments, and coordinated with British allies under Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington. The term guerrilla itself, derived from these Spanish insurgents, reflects the tactical innovation and resilience that defined Spain's response. Ordinary citizens, from peasants to urban artisans, became combatants, transforming the landscape of warfare and national resistance. Amid the chaos of occupation, Spain sought to redefine governance and legitimacy. In 1812, the Cortes drafted the Constitution of Cádiz, a pioneering liberal charter that codified principles of national sovereignty, separation of powers, and individual rights. Known as La Pepa, this constitution represented a radical departure from absolutism, introducing parliamentary structures, curbing monarchical authority, and articulating universal male suffrage, albeit limited in practice. Although Ferdinand VII later repudiated the constitution upon his restoration, its influence persisted, inspiring liberal movements across Spain and Latin America and establishing the ideological foundations for the 19th century struggle between absolutism and liberalism. The Peninsular War's social and economic impact was profound. Widespread destruction, disruption of agriculture, and occupation by foreign armies devastated cities and the countryside. Trade routes were obstructed, taxes were levied on desperate populations, and famine threatened regions across the peninsula. Yet these hardships also fostered a sense of national identity, as disparate provinces and social groups coalesced around the defense of Spanish sovereignty. The war blurred traditional social hierarchies, empowering local leaders and militias while demonstrating the capacity of collective resistance to challenge a superior military power. Spain's colonial empire faced parallel upheaval. The chaos of Napoleon's invasion destabilized imperial authority in the Americas. Local elites in colonies such as Mexico, Venezuela, and Colombia took advantage of Spain's weakened governance to assert autonomy, initially claiming loyalty to the deposed Ferdinand VII, but increasingly embracing independence movements. Between 1810 and 1825, Spain lost nearly all of its American territories, marking the end of its preeminent colonial empire in the Western Hemisphere. These losses reshaped Spain's global influence, concentrating attention on the Iberian Peninsula and its remaining overseas possessions, such as Cuba and the Philippines, while also redefining Spanish identity and political priorities. The restoration of Ferdinand VII in 1814 reintroduced absolutism, undoing many liberal reforms established during the Napoleonic crisis. His reign, characterized by repression, censorship, and political purges, fueled resistance and rebellion, especially among liberal factions who had embraced constitutional governance during the war. The pendulum between absolutism and liberalism defined Spanish politics throughout the 19th century, manifesting in repeated conflicts known as the Carlist Wars. These dynastic and ideological struggles pitted conservative supporters of Carlos, the king's brother, against liberal factions defending the succession of Isabella II, intertwining questions of monarchy, succession, and governance with regional, social, and ideological divisions. The First Carlist War, 1833 to 1840, exemplified the complexities of Spain's post-Napoleonic political landscape. Rural strongholds in Navarre, the Basque Country, and Catalonia became centers of conservative resistance, advocating traditional monarchy, Catholic values, and local privileges. The liberal government, controlling central regions and major cities, relied on emerging professional armies and urban support to maintain authority. Guerrilla tactics and regional militias, reminiscent of the Peninsular War, played decisive roles, highlighting the persistence of irregular warfare in Spain's political culture. The conflict entrenched ideological divisions, shaped regional identities, and delayed political stability, while also forging the narrative of a nation in transition from absolutism to constitutional monarchy. Industrialization and modernization began to take root despite political turmoil. Urban centers like Barcelona, Bilbao, and Madrid experienced modest industrial growth, particularly in textiles, shipbuilding, and mining. Railroads and infrastructure projects, though unevenly developed, facilitated internal trade and communication. Economic reforms sought to stimulate growth, promote commerce, and integrate provincial economies into a national framework. However, these efforts were hampered by political instability, regional resistance, and lingering feudal structures in rural areas. The uneven pace of modernization reflected the challenge of transforming a society still reeling from war, occupation, and imperial contraction. Liberal movements, inspired by Enlightenment principles and revolutionary currents across Europe, continued to challenge absolutism. Constitutions were drafted and repealed, parliaments convened and dissolved, and the loss of Spain's American colonies had far-reaching consequences. Economic disruption, reduced access to raw materials, and diminished global prestige compelled Spain to focus inward, addressing domestic development, industrialization, and political cohesion. Remaining overseas possessions, particularly Cuba and the Philippines, became central to Spain's economic strategy, providing resources, trade routes, and strategic naval bases. The empire's contraction necessitated adaptation, forcing Spanish governance, commerce, and military strategy to concentrate on fewer, but more manageable territories, while also redefining national identity in an era of global change. Spain's military and naval forces, restructured after the Napoleonic War, continued to play a critical role in maintaining internal order and defending remaining imperial holdings. Lessons learned from guerrilla warfare and European campaigns informed military doctrine, while technological advances in artillery, fortifications, and naval construction were gradually incorporated. However, the Spanish armed forces faced ongoing challenges of funding, recruitment, and training, reflecting the broader tension between ambition and capacity that characterized Spain's post-Napoleonic era. By the mid-19th century, Spain had begun to stabilize politically under alternating constitutional and monarchist frameworks, though tensions persisted. Isabella II ascended the throne in 1833, navigating a country marked by factionalism, Carlist uprisings, and the lingering effects of Napoleonic disruption. Parliamentary systems, liberal reforms, and centralized administration coexisted uneasily with regional identities, entrenched conservatism, and social inequality. This period highlighted the ongoing negotiation between modernity and tradition, illustrating Spain's complex path toward constitutional monarchy and liberal governance. Social and cultural life in post-Napoleonic Spain reflected the intersection of tradition, reform, and adaptation. Urban centers became hubs of intellectual and cultural activity, fostering newspapers, literary societies, and educational institutions. The influence of liberal ideas, particularly regarding education, civil rights, and governance, gradually permeated society, shaping political discourse and civic engagement. Yet social inequality, rural poverty, and regionalism remained persistent challenges, reflecting the uneven pace of modernization and the enduring impact of centuries of conquest, empire, and war. The period from 1808 to 1874, encompassing the Napoleonic Wars, the Peninsular War, the Cortes Constitution, the Carlist Wars, and liberal experimentation, represents a defining era in Spanish history. Spain emerged from Napoleonic occupation transformed, politically, economically, and socially. The struggle between absolutism and liberalism, the loss of the American Empire, and the pressures of modernization created a dynamic, often volatile environment. Guerrilla resistance, liberal constitutions, and civil conflict exemplify the interplay of tradition and change, reflecting the resilience of the Spanish state and its people in the face of profound upheaval. By the close of this period, Spain had established the foundations of a modern nation-state, even as it grappled with lingering divisions. Constitutional monarchy, parliamentary institutions, and centralized administration coexisted with regional identities, ideological factionalism, and social challenges. The legacies of Napoleonic invasion, liberal reform, and colonial contraction would continue to shape Spain's political, economic, and cultural trajectory, influencing subsequent developments in industrialization, nationalism, and participation in European and global affairs. The period stands as a testament to Spain's capacity for adaptation, resistance, and transformation in the face of external invasion and internal contestation, defining the contours of modern Spanish identity. The latter decades of the 19th century ushered in a period of fragile stability for Spain, a nation still grappling with the political, economic, and social legacies of Napoleonic disruption, liberal experimentation, and the loss of its once vast colonial empire. The Bourbon monarchy was restored in 1874 under Alfonso XII, following the tumultuous period of the First Spanish Republic, 1873 to 1874, which had been marked by political fragmentation, uprisings, and regional dissent. The Restoration period established a constitutional monarchy designed to reconcile the conflicting pressures of tradition and modernization, consolidating power while seeking political stability through a delicate balance between monarchy, parliamentary institutions, and emerging political parties. Alfonso XI's return marked the implementation of a system known as Turno Pacifico, in which two dominant parties, the conservatives and the liberals, alternated power in a controlled, quasi-parliamentary rotation. This system was intended to prevent political instability and provide continuity, yet it relied heavily on electoral manipulation, patronage networks, and the suppression of dissenting voices. While the Turno Pacifico maintained formal constitutional governance, it also exposed the limitations of Spain's political modernization, corruption, elite control, and the marginalization of regional and minority voices persisted. The Restoration system, for all its stability, masked underlying tensions that would resurface in later decades. Economically, Spain confronted the dual challenge of modernization and persistent underdevelopment. Industrialization progressed unevenly, concentrated primarily in Catalonia, the Basque Country, and Madrid, with sectors such as textiles, steel, and shipbuilding experiencing growth. Railroads expanded, connecting urban centers and facilitating trade, while mining operations increased output to support industrial activity and export demands. Despite these advances, large parts of rural Spain remained agrarian, characterized by subsistence farming, feudal remnants, and entrenched inequality. Regional disparities in economic development fueled social discontent, migration to urban centers, and the rise of labor movements advocating workers' rights and political representation. Social transformation accompanied industrial and economic change. Urbanization created new working classes, intellectual circles, and civic associations. Trade unions, socialist organizations, and anarchist groups emerged as significant political actors, challenging the dominance of the monarchy, traditional elites, and the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church maintained substantial influence over education, morality, and social norms, yet secular and liberal currents increasingly challenged clerical authority, reflecting the broader ideological shifts of Europe during this period. Social movements, both reformist and revolutionary, embodied the tension between tradition and modernization that defined Spain's Restoration era. Spain's imperial decline became increasingly evident with the approach of the Spanish-American War of 1898, a conflict that would decisively mark the end of Spain's centuries-long overseas dominion. By the late 19th century, Spain retained only a few significant colonies: Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam, facing mounting pressure from nationalist movements within these territories and from the expansionist ambitions of the United States. Cuba's struggle for independence, characterized by guerrilla warfare, insurgency, and socio-economic disruption, became the focal point of Spanish military and political attention. The loss of colonial control highlighted Spain's declining international influence, juxtaposed with the ascendancy of the United States as a global power. The Spanish-American War, precipitated by the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor and amplified by international tensions, led to a brief but decisive military conflict. Spanish forces, though committed and strategically positioned in colonies, were outmatched by superior American naval power and modernized military capabilities. By the end of 1898, Spain had lost Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam, a catastrophic blow to national pride, economic interests, and international prestige. This defeat, often termed El Desastre del 98, triggered a profound national introspection known as the Generation of 98, in which writers, intellectuals, and reformers examined the causes of Spain's decline and the cultural, political, and economic reforms necessary for national regeneration. Culturally, the Generation of 98 marked a turning point in Spanish intellectual life. Thinkers and writers, including Miguel de Unamuno, Pío Baroja, and Azorín, interrogated the failures of Spanish society, governance, and identity. They explored themes of decay, regeneration, regional identity, and historical consciousness, reflecting a profound engagement with Spain's past, present, and potential future. Literature, philosophy, and historical analysis became instruments for societal reflection and critique, emphasizing the need to reconcile tradition with modernization, preserve cultural identity, and adapt to the demands of a rapidly changing world. The loss of colonies also had economic consequences. Spain's overseas trade contracted, revenues from colonial administration ceased, and opportunities for resource extraction diminished. At the same time, domestic industries, transportation networks, and urban commerce became more central to economic survival and growth. Investment in infrastructure, banking, and emerging industries was prioritized, reflecting the necessity of modernizing the nation internally, as the imperial lifelines that had sustained Spain for centuries were severed. Economic adaptation was both a practical and symbolic imperative, as Spain sought to redefine itself as a European rather than global power. Politically, the period remained turbulent despite the Restoration framework. Regional nationalism, particularly in Catalonia and the Basque Country, gained momentum, seeking autonomy, recognition of cultural identity, and influence over local governance. Labor movements and socialist organizations advocated for workers' rights, political participation, and social reform, frequently clashing with state authorities and conservative elites. By the early 20th century, Spain had established the structural foundations of a modern nation-state, but it remained politically fragile and socially divided. The monarchy, parliamentary institutions, and political parties functioned alongside persistent regionalism, social unrest, and ideological conflict. Reforms attempted to balance modernization with tradition, yet their implementation was uneven and contested. Spain's trajectory during this period illustrates the tension between continuity and change, as the nation navigated the legacy of imperial decline, industrialization, and political evolution. The Spanish-American War acted as a catalyst for reflection and transformation, highlighting the limitations of Spain's global influence and the necessity of domestic consolidation. National debates regarding identity, governance, and modernization intensified, informing political discourse, intellectual inquiry, and cultural production. The loss of overseas territories symbolized both the end of Spain's imperial ambition and the beginning of a renewed focus on internal development, modernization, and the negotiation of a new place in the European and global order. The Restoration and Spanish-American War periods set the stage for the turbulent decades that would follow. Social movements, regionalist aspirations, labor unrest, and ideological polarization became central to Spanish politics, culminating in debates over monarchy, republic, and democracy. Economic modernization, infrastructural development, and cultural regeneration coexisted with persistent inequality, political corruption, and elite dominance, reflecting the complexity of nation-building in a society emerging from imperial contraction and global marginalization. By the eve of the Second Republic in 1931, Spain had undergone a century of profound transformation. It had recovered a measure of political stability under a constitutional monarchy, endured the trauma of imperial collapse, experienced industrial and infrastructural growth, and fostered a vibrant cultural and intellectual life. Yet beneath this surface, unresolved tensions regarding governance, social justice, regional autonomy, and national identity remained, setting the stage for the revolutionary, civil, and ideological conflicts that would define the early 20th century. The era from 1874 to 1931 is thus a story of restoration, adaptation, and reflection. Spain confronted the challenge of reconciling centuries of imperial grandeur with the realities of diminished global influence, social change, and political fragmentation. The Restoration system and the response to the Spanish-American War exemplify the interplay of stability and crisis, tradition and reform, ambition and limitation. Cultural introspection, economic restructuring, and political experimentation during this period not only defined Spain's immediate trajectory, but also provided the context for the dramatic transformations of the 20th century. By 1931, Spain stood at a historical crossroads. The abdication of Alfonso XIII and the proclamation of the Second Spanish Republic marked the end of the Bourbon monarchy and the beginning of a bold, turbulent experiment in modern governance. Emerging from decades of Restoration-era politics, regional tensions, and social inequalities, the Republic embodied both hope and contention. Its architects envisioned a democratic Spain rooted in civil liberties, secular governance, and modernization. Yet the country was a tinderbox of social, religious, and ideological conflicts, where political aspirations clashed violently with entrenched traditions and regional loyalties. The Second Republic, formally established on April 14, 1931, quickly embarked on ambitious reforms aimed at transforming Spain into a modern state. A new constitution, approved in 1931, codified universal suffrage for men and women, restructured governmental institutions, and sought to curtail the influence of the Catholic Church in public affairs. The Republic pursued land reform, aiming to redistribute large estates, latifundia, to peasant farmers and alleviate rural poverty, particularly in regions such as Andalusia, Extremadura, and Castile-La Mancha. The period from 1931 to 1939 illustrates the fragility of democratic institutions when confronted by deep-seated social, economic, and ideological divisions. The Second Republic embodied progressive aspirations, including civil liberties, land reform, and secular governance, yet it struggled to implement its vision in a society divided by entrenched conservative forces, regionalism, and economic inequality. The resulting civil war exemplifies the lethal consequences of polarization, the limits of coalition politics, and the intersection of national and international interests in shaping domestic outcomes. Spain's experience during these years remains a stark example of how democracy, reform, and societal transformation can be both aspirational and perilously fragile in the face of structural challenges. The legacy of the Second Republic and the Civil War shaped Spain's subsequent history. The conflict entrenched ideological divisions, regional grievances, and social trauma, influencing political discourse, governance, and cultural life for decades. The Republican experiment, though short-lived, provided a model of democratic aspiration, social reform, and civic engagement, while its failure highlighted the risks inherent in confronting entrenched powers, social inequities, and ideological extremism. The period serves as both a cautionary tale and a foundation for understanding Spain's later transition to democracy, illustrating the enduring tension between reform, tradition, and authoritarianism. In 1939, after nearly 3 years of devastating civil war, Spain emerged under the iron grip of Francisco Franco, whose nationalist forces had decisively defeated the Republican government. The victory of Franco's regime marked the beginning of nearly 4 decades of authoritarian rule, fundamentally reshaping Spanish society, politics, and identity. The Francoist state was built upon the pillars of centralized authority, nationalism, Catholic conservatism, and the suppression of dissent. Political pluralism was abolished, regional autonomy was curtailed, and censorship permeated public life. The shadow of the Civil War and the legacy of ideological division defined the early years of Francoist Spain, as the nation grappled with the trauma of conflict and the imperative of national reconstruction under an uncompromising dictatorship. Initially, Francoist Spain faced monumental challenges. The country was economically devastated, its infrastructure destroyed, and social cohesion fractured. International isolation compounded these difficulties. Spain was excluded from the post-World War II reconstruction plans, shunned by both Western democracies and the Soviet bloc. Franco's regime pursued autarky, seeking economic self-sufficiency through state control of industry, rationing, and protectionist policies. While these measures aimed to stabilize the nation and consolidate political control, they often resulted in inefficiency, stagnation, and scarcity, leaving the Spanish populace to endure widespread poverty, malnutrition, and limited access to consumer goods. Social and cultural life during early Francoism was tightly controlled. The Catholic Church played a central role in education, morality, and public discourse, shaping a national identity that emphasized traditional values, religious orthodoxy, and hierarchical social structures. Regional languages, including Catalan, Basque, and Galician, were suppressed in favor of Castilian Spanish, and expressions of regional identity were severely restricted. Political opposition was ruthlessly repressed. Former Republicans, leftists, anarchists, and suspected dissidents faced imprisonment, forced labor, or execution. This climate of fear and control sought to erase the memory of ideological plurality and enforce a homogeneous vision of Spain under Franco's centralized authority. Despite the repression, the 1950s and 1960s witnessed profound economic and social transformations. Spain experienced the so-called Spanish miracle, a period of rapid industrialization, urbanization, and economic growth. Development policies, including investment in infrastructure, expansion of tourism, and promotion of industrial exports, facilitated modernization and integration into the global economy. Cities like Madrid, Barcelona, and Bilbao grew dramatically, absorbing rural migrants seeking employment in factories, construction, and service industries. The economic boom transformed Spanish society, creating a burgeoning middle class, increasing literacy rates, and fostering new patterns of consumption, even under the shadow of political authoritarianism. The 1960s also saw the rise of a new cultural consciousness, particularly among students, intellectuals, and urban professionals. While overt dissent remained dangerous, underground movements, clandestine publications, and cultural expressions subtly challenged the regime. The tension between modernization and repression became increasingly evident. Spain was economically advancing, socially transforming, and culturally evolving, yet political freedoms remained constrained. Franco's death in 1975 would ultimately release the pressures built up over decades of social, economic, and cultural change, paving the way for political liberalization. The transition to democracy, known as the Spanish Transition, was orchestrated under the guidance of King Juan Carlos I, whom Franco had appointed as his successor to preserve continuity of the monarchy. Contrary to expectations of authoritarian perpetuation, Juan Carlos facilitated a peaceful transition, embracing democratic reforms, legalizing political parties, and overseeing free elections. The 1978 Constitution codified parliamentary democracy, civil liberties, separation of powers, and regional autonomy, establishing Spain as a modern constitutional monarchy. This document also recognized the diverse identities within Spain, granting autonomous communities, such as Catalonia and the Basque Country, legislative and executive powers while maintaining the unity of the Spanish state. Spain's reintegration into the international community followed swiftly. In 1986, Spain joined the European Economic Community, later the European Union, marking its full participation in European economic, political, and cultural affairs. Membership facilitated economic growth, modernization of infrastructure, and alignment with European legal and regulatory frameworks. Spain also normalized diplomatic relations with former colonial territories and European neighbors, establishing itself as a credible and stable democratic actor in global affairs. This reintegration symbolized not only political rehabilitation, but also the country's emergence from decades of isolation and authoritarian control. Political evolution since the transition has been marked by the consolidation of democratic institutions, a vibrant multi-party system, and the negotiation of regional autonomy within a unified national framework. Challenges have persisted. The Basque separatist organization ETA waged a campaign of violence for decades before declaring a permanent ceasefire in 2011, while Catalonia's independence movement has generated recurrent constitutional and political crises. Economic volatility, including the financial crisis of 2008 to 2014, tested Spain's social and political resilience, revealing vulnerabilities in employment, public finance, and social cohesion. Yet, Spain's democratic institutions have largely endured, demonstrating the capacity for adaptation, negotiation, and compromise in the face of structural and ideological pressures. Culturally, post-Franco Spain has experienced a renaissance. Freedom of expression, regional cultural revival, and international engagement fostered new artistic, literary, and intellectual movements. Film, literature, and visual arts flourished, exploring themes of historical memory, identity, and reconciliation with the past. Spain's engagement with its history, the Civil War, Francoism, and colonial legacies has become a central aspect of national discourse, reflecting the enduring significance of historical memory in shaping contemporary identity. Museums, memorials, and public debates highlight the complexity of Spain's past, acknowledging both the achievements and the traumas that define modern Spanish society. Spain's economic trajectory has also evolved significantly. Industrial diversification, technological development, and integration into global markets transformed Spain from a largely agrarian, protectionist economy into a modern, service-oriented economy. Tourism emerged as a critical sector, capitalizing on Spain's cultural, historical, and natural assets. Infrastructure, including transportation networks, energy systems, and urban development, expanded rapidly, supporting domestic prosperity and international competitiveness. Economic integration within Europe reinforced Spain's capacity for trade, investment, and innovation, though regional disparities and unemployment remain ongoing challenges. Socially, Spain has undergone a remarkable transformation. Urbanization, education expansion, and increased labor participation reshaped societal structures, while social policies in healthcare, welfare, and gender equality reflected broader European trends. Women's rights, LGBTQ+ recognition, and multicultural integration have become central components of Spain's evolving identity, marking a profound departure from the repressive social norms of the Franco era. These changes reflect the nation's commitment to democratic principles, civil liberties, and the negotiation of diverse identities within a shared national framework. The period from 1939 to the present thus encapsulates a profound narrative of repression, resilience, modernization, and democratization. Francoist Spain exemplifies the extremes of authoritarian control, while the post-1975 democratic era demonstrates the possibilities of reconciliation, adaptation, and institutional evolution. Spain's trajectory highlights the interplay between historical memory, political reform, economic modernization, and cultural renewal, illustrating the dynamic processes that have shaped the nation's contemporary identity. Spain today is a modern parliamentary democracy, integrated into European and global systems, yet mindful of its complex historical legacy. The reconciliation of regional autonomy, social pluralism, and national unity continues to be a defining challenge. Political debate, economic policy, and cultural expression are informed by centuries of conquest, empire, civil war, authoritarian rule, and democratic transition. Spain's story from Francoist repression to democratic consolidation demonstrates the enduring capacity of societies to navigate historical trauma, adapt to changing circumstances, and construct frameworks of governance that balance continuity, innovation, and inclusivity. The narrative of Francoist Spain to modern democracy serves as both a cautionary tale and an inspiring example. It underscores the dangers of authoritarianism, the fragility of social and political cohesion, and the transformative potential of reform, dialogue, and institutional design. It reflects the resilience of a nation scarred by civil conflict, yet capable of embracing democratic governance, economic modernization, cultural flourishing, and social inclusion. Spain's journey from dictatorship to democracy illuminates the broader patterns of historical transformation, demonstrating how societies can emerge from the shadows of repression to construct a future grounded in rights, representation, and participation. From the first Roman legions to the democratic Spain of today, the story of this land is a testament to resilience, ambition, and transformation. Kingdoms rose and fell, empires stretched across oceans, cultures collided and intertwined, and through it all, the people of Spain forged an identity that echoes across continents and centuries. Conquest and colonization, civil war and dictatorship, renewal and modernization, all threads woven into the complex tapestry of Spanish history. This is Spain, a nation shaped by its past, yet continually defining its future.